Alcatraz was never meant to be just a prison. It was meant to be a warning. Rising from the icy waters of San Francisco Bay, surrounded by powerful currents and bone-chilling winds, the island stood like a silent guardian of fear. From a distance, it looked almost peaceful, floating beneath rolling fog and circling seagulls. But for the men who were sent there, Alcatraz was the end of the line, a place where reputation meant nothing, power disappeared, and escape was considered impossible. When the federal government opened Alcatraz as a maximum security prison in 1934, America was in the middle of a violent era. Gangsters ruled cities, bank robbers became celebrities, and organized crime was spreading across the country. The government needed a symbol of control, a fortress that would prove no criminal was untouchable. Alcatraz became that symbol. Located nearly 2 miles offshore, the island was naturally protected by freezing water that averaged between 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The currents were unpredictable and strong enough to drag even skilled swimmers out toward the open ocean. Sharks were often rumored to patrol the waters, adding another psychological barrier to any escape attempt. Officials carefully selected prisoners for Alcatraz. This was not an ordinary prison. It was designed for inmates who had caused trouble elsewhere, men who refused to follow rules, who had attempted escapes, or who carried influence inside other prisons. Among them was the infamous Al Capone, once the king of Chicago's criminal empire. In Alcatraz, Capone was no longer a powerful gangster. He was simply inmate number 85. His wealth and connections meant nothing behind the iron bars. That was the purpose of the island, to strip away identity and replace it with discipline. Life inside Alcatraz followed a rigid routine. Each day began early with the sound of a bell echoing through the concrete corridors. Prisoners lined up for head counts, marched in silence to the dining hall, and ate meals under strict supervision. Surprisingly, the food was considered decent compared to other prisons at the time. The administration believed that good meals reduced unrest. But make no mistake, this was not a comfortable place. The cells were small, measuring roughly 5 by 9 feet, barely enough room for a metal bed, a tiny fold-down shelf, a sink with cold water, and a toilet. The walls were thick and unforgiving, painted in dull colors that reflected little light. There was no privacy. Guards could see directly into each cell at all times. Silence was strongly enforced. Talking during certain hours was forbidden, and even during allowed times, conversation was limited. Over time, the silence became heavier than the steel bars. The isolation began to work its way into the minds of the inmates. Some men adapted, others slowly unraveled. The psychological pressure was constant. Imagine staring out your cell window and seeing the bright lights of San Francisco at night, so close you could almost believe freedom was within reach. The laughter of people carried faintly across the water on windy evenings, a cruel reminder of a world just beyond the waves. For many prisoners, that view was torture. Alcatraz was not built to rehabilitate. It was built to control. Discipline was absolute. Any violation of rules could lead to punishment, and the most feared punishment area was known simply as the Hole. Officially called D Block, it housed isolation cells where inmates were confined in near darkness. Inside the Hole, the air felt colder, the silence deeper. Prisoners could be locked away for days with minimal human contact. Some described it as mentally crushing. Time blurred together. The absence of light and sound distorted reality. While official reports maintained that the prison was orderly and efficient, Former inmates later revealed stories of paranoia, anxiety, and emotional breakdowns. Alcatraz prided itself on being escape-proof, but over the years, several men tried to challenge that claim. In 1937, Theodore Cole and Ralph Rowe slipped through a workshop window and jumped into the bay. The guards immediately sounded alarms, and a search began. The official conclusion stated they drowned in the freezing currents. Yet their bodies were never recovered. The ocean kept its secrets. Each escape attempt only strengthened Alcatraz's reputation. Guards and watchtowers carried rifles and scanned the grounds constantly. Frequent headcounts ensured that no inmate went missing unnoticed. The island's design worked in harmony with nature. Cliffs, sharp rocks, and icy water forming a natural barrier. Still, the idea of escape never fully disappeared. For some men, the risk of death was better than the certainty of confinement. By the late 1950s, Alcatraz had already cemented its place in American culture as the ultimate prison. Newspapers wrote about it with fascination. Radio programs described its strict discipline and dangerous inmates. To the public, it represented justice and strength. But behind the headlines, cracks were beginning to show. The buildings were aging. Salt air corroded metal surfaces. Maintenance costs were rising dramatically because every supply, food, fuel, clothing, had to be transported by boat. It cost nearly 3 times more to operate than other federal prisons. Despite these issues, the legend of Alcatraz remained powerful. And then came the escape that would change everything. In 1962, 3 inmates, Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin, began quietly planning what many believed could not be done. Frank Morris was known for his intelligence, scoring exceptionally high on IQ tests. The Anglin brothers were experienced swimmers, raised in Florida, comfortable in water. Together, they formed a plan that required patience, creativity, and absolute secrecy. Using stolen spoons from the dining hall, they began chipping away at the crumbling concrete around the ventilation grates in their cells. The walls, weakened by years of moisture, slowly gave way. To avoid detection, they carefully crafted fake vents from cardboard and painted them to match the original surface. Each night, after the guards completed head counts, they placed dummy heads in their beds, sculpted from soap, toothpaste, and toilet paper, with real human hair collected from the prison barbershop. In the dim light of the corridor, the fake heads looked convincing enough. Behind their cells was an unused utility corridor that led upward toward the roof. Over several months, they secretly expanded their escape route. They also stitched together more than 50 raincoats stolen from the prison supply to create a makeshift raft. The plan was daring, almost unbelievable. On the night of June 11, 1962, they made their move. After slipping through the vent openings, they climbed into the utility corridor, crawled up to the roof, and carefully descended a kitchen pipe to reach the shoreline. Under the cover of darkness, they inflated their homemade raft and pushed into the freezing bay. By morning, guards discovered the empty cells and the lifeless dummy heads staring up from the pillows. Panic spread quickly. A massive search operation began immediately. Boats scanned the water. Helicopters circled overhead. The FBI launched an intensive investigation that would last years. Pieces of raincoat material were found floating in the bay. A homemade paddle fragment washed ashore. But the men themselves were never found. Official reports concluded they most likely drowned in the freezing currents, yet without bodies, doubt remained. Some investigators later argued that if the men timed their escape correctly with the tide, survival was possible. Rumors began to circulate. Letters allegedly written by the escapees surfaced years later. Family members claimed to receive postcards from South America. Photographs emerged that some believed showed the Anglin brothers alive decades after the escape. The FBI eventually closed the case in 1979, stating there was no credible evidence of survival. However, the U.S. Marshal Service continues to investigate leads to this day. The mystery transformed Alcatraz from a prison into a legend. But beyond the escape story lies a deeper truth: the emotional cost of confinement on an isolated island. Alcatraz was a place where discipline ruled, but loneliness thrived. Men spent years staring at the same gray walls, listening to the same echoing footsteps, breathing the same cold air drifting in from the bay. Some inmates found small ways to cope, playing instruments in the prison band, reading books from the modest library, or working jobs that broke the monotony. Others struggled silently. The island itself seemed alive at night, creaking under shifting winds, fog wrapping around buildings like a curtain hiding untold stories. Guards later admitted that even they sometimes felt uneasy walking the corridors after dark. There was something about Alcatraz that went beyond concrete and steel, something psychological. It represented isolation in its purest form. And yet, despite its fearsome reputation, Alcatraz did not last forever. By 1963, financial strain and infrastructure decay forced the government to shut it down. After nearly 3 decades as a federal penitentiary, the prison closed its doors. But the story did not end there. The island would soon enter a new chapter, one that no one expected. After the prison officially closed in March 1963, many believed Alcatraz would slowly fade into obscurity, just another abandoned government facility left to decay under layers of salt air and silence. The last remaining inmates were transferred quietly to other federal prisons, leaving behind empty cells, rusting bars, and corridors that once echoed with strict commands and heavy footsteps. For a brief moment, the island seemed frozen in time. Furniture remained where it had been used. Dishes sat stacked in the dining hall. The hole stood empty, its dark isolation cells no longer occupied, still carrying an unsettling presence. Nature began reclaiming the concrete fortress. Paint peeled, metal corroded. Windows cracked under strong winds sweeping across the bay. But Alcatraz was not done making history. In 1969, something unexpected happened that would redefine the island's meaning forever. Families moved onto the island. They painted messages on the water tower and walls, including the now famous phrase, "Indians welcome." For the first time, Alcatraz was no longer a place of punishment. It became a symbol of resistance and cultural pride. The occupation drew international attention, shining a spotlight on Native American rights and injustices that had long been ignored. Though the federal government eventually removed the remaining activists in 1971, the occupation changed how many Americans viewed the island. It was no longer just a prison. It was a stage for social change. By the early 1970s, Alcatraz reopened to the public as part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Tour boats began carrying visitors across the same cold waters that once terrified inmates. People walked through cell blocks, stepped inside solitary confinement cells, and listened to recorded stories from former guards and prisoners. Tourism transformed the island into one of San Francisco's most popular attractions. Yet even as a tourist site, the atmosphere remains heavy. Visitors often describe a strange feeling while standing inside the empty cells. Perhaps it is imagination, or perhaps it is the weight of history pressing against the walls. The wind still whistles through broken corridors. The fog still rolls in without warning. And the mystery of 1962 still lingers like an unanswered question hanging in the air. Over the decades, investigators, journalists, and amateur historians have tried to solve the escape of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. Modern computer simulations of tidal patterns suggest that if the men launched their raft at exactly the right moment, they could have reached Marin Headland safely. In 2013, a letter surfaced claiming to be written by Frank Morris, stating that he had survived and was living under a new identity. The letter was tested by the FBI for fingerprints and DNA, but results were inconclusive. In 2015, a photograph discovered in Brazil showed two men who bore striking resemblance to the Anglin brothers. Facial recognition experts suggested similarities, but nothing could be proven definitively. Officially, the case remains open with the U.S. Marshals Service. The possibility that they survived continues to fascinate millions. But perhaps the real mystery is not whether they escaped. Perhaps it is what drove them to try. Alcatraz was designed to eliminate hope. The structure, the rules, the isolation, all of it aimed to remove the idea that freedom was possible. Yet even in the most controlled environment, the human desire for freedom refused to die. That may be the true legacy of Alcatraz. It proved that walls can restrict the body, but they struggle to contain determination. Beyond the famous escape, countless untold personal battles took place inside those cells. Men arrived hardened by crime, but many left changed in ways that were not always visible. Some former inmates later admitted that the strict routine forced them to confront themselves for the first time. Without distractions, without criminal networks, without constant noise, they faced silence, and in that silence, reflection. Others carried emotional scars long after their release. The experience of isolation lingered in their memories. Nightmares of locked doors and echoing corridors followed them into the outside world. Even guards were affected. Several former officers described Alcatraz as a place that demanded emotional strength. Living and working on an isolated island meant separation from the mainland community. Families of guards resided on the island as well, creating a strange contrast. Children playing within sight of one of America's most feared prisons. Baseball games were held on the recreation yard. Gardens were planted near cell blocks. Life existed alongside confinement, a reminder that Alcatraz was not just steel and concrete, but also human stories layered on top of one another. Financially, the prison had always been unsustainable. It cost far more to operate than other facilities because every necessity had to be transported by boat. Infrastructure damage from salt exposure required constant repair. By the time it closed, officials calculated that millions would be needed to restore it properly. The government chose closure instead. Ironically, that decision amplified its legend. If Alcatraz had remained open, it might have become just another prison in the system. Instead, it froze in time, preserved as a symbol of a specific era in American history, an era defined by gangsters, strict federal authority, and dramatic headlines. Today, documentaries, films, and books continue to revisit its story. Hollywood has recreated its escape in movies, turning speculation into cinematic suspense. Paranormal investigators even claim the island is haunted, pointing to cold spots and unexplained sounds within the abandoned hospital wing. Whether one believes such stories or not, they contribute to the aura surrounding the rock. The name alone carries weight. Alcatraz. It does not simply represent incarceration. It represents isolation at the edge of society, where land meets unforgiving water. It represents power, control, and the lengths a government will go to enforce order. But it also represents resistance, from inmates who attempted escape to activists who occupied the island decades later. Perhaps that is why the story continues to captivate the American imagination. It touches on universal themes: freedom versus confinement, authority versus defiance, hope versus despair. Standing on the island today, one can see the skyline of San Francisco shining brightly across the bay. The city feels close enough to reach, just as it did for the men locked inside those narrow cells. That visual contrast remains powerful. Freedom within sight, yet separated by cold water and circumstance. In the end, the dark truth about Alcatraz is not just about punishment or mystery. It is about human endurance. It is about what happens when individuals are pushed to their limits, when silence becomes overwhelming, when escape feels like the only path left. Some accepted their fate. Some fought against it. And 3 men may have vanished into legend because they refused to believe that any system was truly unbreakable. The prison that promised no one could escape still cannot escape its own mystery. Decades later, questions remain unanswered, stories remain debated, and the island continues to stand quietly in the middle of the bay, watching boats pass just as it once watched prisoners arrive in chains. Alcatraz was built to contain criminals, but instead it created one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. And maybe that is the ultimate irony. The place designed to eliminate uncertainty became defined by it. Even now, as tourists step off ferries and cameras flash against weathered walls, the legend grows stronger. Because deep down, people are not just fascinated by prisons. They are fascinated by the possibility that somewhere, against impossible odds, someone might have made it across the freezing water and into freedom. And until undeniable proof surfaces, the question will remain suspended in the fog over San Francisco Bay. Did Alcatraz truly hold them? Or did the rock finally let them go?